It is a testament to the size of Idaho that one of our local legislators had a long, long drive to get here this morning. I was talking about this last week with Lance Clow, and he mentioned that we have a state senator who is serving down in the Rogerson area, but if he'd like to get to some of his constituents, he has to drive out of the district to Twin Falls and then loop back around on the interstate to get out to see those folks. Christy Zito has a similar type of situation in her district. Of course, she's joining us. She comes down from Elmore County, but she represents also Owyhee County and parts of Twin Falls County. And first of all, welcome back to our studio.
Good morning, Bill Colley. Thank you.
It's a long drive for you, isn't it?
Just under an hour.
But I love that drive. I mean, that is probably between here and Boise is one of the two or three most scenic drives in the state.
It's a good drive. The biggest challenge you have coming to Twin Falls in the morning is the sun.
Yes, the sun and then the bridge. But we had when the highway construction was going gangbusters a few months ago, and Congressman Labrador came into the studio, and he said that they had timed it like they normally would for this trip, but they didn't take into account that traffic. Now he got in here, he was on time, but it was like just at the last minute, so there wasn't any pre-discussion or anything like that. But first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's always good to visit with you, Bill.
So you are going back for another session on Monday. I understand, though, there's been a lot of discussion that's been going on. In fact, people have been in meetings already in Boise as far as planning and talking, getting background from department heads and the like. So it's not like you all walked away last spring and then just took the time off and went back to tending your goats.
No, I don't think it's a job that you take time off from. I know that for me personally, there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't receive an email or a phone call or spend time with someone in the district, listening to their challenges, listening to what they're concerned about. So it's kind of like being a mom.
Yeah.
It's a 24/7 full-time job.
Some people in government on the other side of the political aisle think government should be mother and dad, but that's
Well, I don't.
we wanted to point out it will be an active session. I'm told by some of your colleagues that there won't be a lot of discussion about social issues that we're dealing. We were just talking with Steve Millington about this in the last half hour. This is going to be much more about pocketbook issues that are coming up. And I know that one that you were on board with last year was the attempt to override the veto of the governor's grocery tax. You had 29 fellow legislators who got on board with a lawsuit. It looked like you might get it, but the judges couldn't come to a majority of them in agreement on it. That's likely going to be one of the earliest things that's worked this year.
I would think it would be. And, unless there was an issue that made it unconstitutional, I'm not sure I understand the governor's thinking there. I would think that when the representatives of the people see something as a good idea and it has that much of a majority when it comes through both houses, that, the House and the Senate, that the governor would be in favor of it.
Now, two things come to mind on this. One is an argument that even if he vetoes it and the veto stays, that the three other men who are likely, one of them will succeed him, who are running in the primary for governor, all favor a repeal. Then the other argument is, okay, if you do repeal it, though, how do you make up the difference in revenue? So those are a couple of things. So if you don't get it this year, I guess it's not the end of the world, right?
Well, it's not the end of the world. No, you can try it again and again and again. It just puts the financial burden on people for another year and another year and another year. Because remember, what we do in 2017 doesn't have an effect until a year later. So every year we're just out another year.
Now, the other argument is, again, it may not be a huge amount of money that the state collects on this tax, but it's still revenue, and we run a pretty tight ship in Idaho if you compare us to places I've lived before. It's relative, I know, but how do you replace that revenue, or would you just simply have to cut spending accordingly?
Well, we increased government in the state of Idaho last year by 9%. Now, my issue with the sales tax situation the way it is now, and it was a grocery tax repeal, is that we gather the money, we take it in, so there are administrative costs there. Then the money's processed, then a check or whatever is sent back, so there are administrative costs there. And going into the session last year, that was a question that I asked was, what does it cost us to collect the money? What does it cost us to administer it? What does it cost us to get it back? How much money are we really actually making? And then the other thing is um, those who receive a SNAP card, the way I understand it, are also entitled to the grocery tax refund. And so, and I could be wrong on this. This was just what I was told by someone. So you have people who are not paying the grocery tax to begin with who are benefiting from the sales tax refund.
We should point out, and I noticed this. I was shopping at Winco a couple of weeks ago, and I don't have to buy a lot of groceries. I'm feeding just one person at the moment at home. But I was watching someone, and a lot of people I know come into town and they go to a Winco or a Costco because they're easier to shop at as if you're buying bulk, especially for a big family. And I know we have a lot of big families in this part of the country. And I watched them sometimes spend $250 at a throw while they're at the store. And I think about the fact that I get that credit. Do they get it in credit for every member of the family, or do they just get one credit when tax time comes around?
Do you know, I've not looked in it that close, Bill, to know. I can't answer that question,
But clearly they're
honestly.
spending a lot more money on
They
the
are.
tax than I am.
Right. And so I don't know if, every household gets a certain amount or if it's a certain amount credited back per person. I don't know that.
We wanted to point out you have a number of your colleagues who have been called at various times a Liberty Group or the Six Pack at one time. I think the number of you has actually grown beyond six now. And you've sometimes been considered a thorn in the side to Republican leadership, even though you're Republicans as well. There's a presentation that your group is doing later this week, Thursday night, and this is going to outline, I guess, goals from the caucus. And I don't know that it's officially even a caucus, but it's going to outline some various goals that you have individually as in that tight knit group.
Well, and we're not a caucus, and I don't see us as like a gang of 8 or 9 or whatever. What I see us as is we are legislators who listen to our constituents, who listen to the people in our district. Um, I think it's important to remember that as Republicans, we have a Republican Party, we have precinct committee people, we have Republican conventions twice a year. We have a resolutions committee at that convention
Mm-hmm.
who will draft resolutions that are supposed to be directives to the legislators. They're not supposed to be something that we just waste a lot of time going to and say that we're part of a Republican Party. And so I see these legislators as people who care about that platform, people who care about what the constituents in their area want. I know that for me, like I told you before, I listen to the people in my district a lot. I hear what they say. A lot of the thoughts that I have on legislation that I'll bring forth have come from conversations with them. And so, I'm not there to be a thorn in anybody's side. I love working with the other legislators. I enjoy the job. Last year, with the Castle Doctrine bill that we had, I had 20 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. That's not exactly a third, but it's close to a third of those. And so it's hard for me to understand why I would be considered a thorn in anyone's side when I can have that kind of a working relationship with that many numbers of people in that body.
I heard a good comment from Heather Scott, who's, I guess, viewed by the media as the leader of the group. And again, I don't know that you have leaders per se,
We don't.
but she was commenting about how most of you come from these more rural districts, and you represent a constituency that maybe isn't as well heeled as, let's say, somebody in Ada County does, and even some Republicans in places like Ada County, and you think about Pocatello and Idaho Falls. Here in Twin, there's probably a little bit more money in people's pockets than what you see in an Elmore County, that when you see in Boundary County or Potter County, what you see in Idaho County, and so those folks, uh, you know, we tend to forget, I think, sometimes in other parts of the state that you're all representing a large block of people, and those people themselves may not think the same as the people in some of the more urbanized districts.
Well, there's no question we probably all think different, but that's the beauty of our country is we're basically a melting pot of thoughts and ideas. But what I see is more than as a financial divide, I see the fact that those legislators, they honor the Constitution and they honor their oath. Um, I like the thought that the role of government is not to do anything that you wouldn't do to your neighbor. Because, for example, let's say when the West was settled and there was no law, people got so that maybe they had to defend themselves so much that they couldn't make a living, which is part of our God-given right to be able to make a living and support our families, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So because you have the right given to you by your creator to be able to defend yourself and to be able to make a living, but you don't have the time to do that per se, you hire someone to do it for you. So you grant them the ability to work in your stead. And that's what government is. Government should never do anything to the citizen that another citizen couldn't do to you. So, for example, Bill, you just get your paycheck and you go in and you cash it, and I walk up to you on the street and I say, I demand that you give me a third of your check, Bill. Now, how is that going to go over? Probably not real well. The government's in the same position. The government should never do anything to a citizen that another citizen couldn't do because we have granted that ability to them because it belongs to us.
We'll take a quick call here. I do want to mention telephone number to reach the show, 208-736-0300. We have a couple of minutes before the first break. The representative is going to be in studio with us until 10 o'clock. We're at 16, and caller, you're up next. You're on the air.
Yes, just listening to Christy, she reminds me of Dorothy Moon, and I don't know if she's friends with her, but I'll tell you what, those two women are on top of the deal and understand the Constitution, understand America, free market capitalism, and, let's hope they both rise to a higher level in our government. I'll hang up.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've known of Dorothy Moon for quite a while. I didn't really know her personally until the last session. She is a great example. She is a patriot in every sense of the word. And for me, there's not much of a higher compliment you can pay someone than to consider them a patriot.
She was out shoveling deep snow all last week. I know that.
I know.
Got about a minute before the break. And, you've got Dorothy, you've got Carrie Hanks, you've got Priscilla Giddings. To a lesser extent, I think Brian Zollinger sometimes works with your group.
Brian's a patriot.
You referenced God-given rights. And I think everybody in government talks about that and agrees with it. But a lot of times I think it's more lip service. And I think that might be the one of the distinguishing traits of that small group of you.
I believe it is. The rights that we have, Bill, were not granted to us by government. I don't give you, as a legislator, the right to defend yourself. I don't give you the right to be able to travel on the highway. That is a right that was innate in you and given to you by your creator long before there was a government. But what government is instituted to do is to protect those rights, to keep order and organization, not to tell you how to live your life, not to make your choices for you. And I think that is the big distinction there, is that, when you take that oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, that's exactly what it means. It doesn't mean, it's not my job, Bill, to tell you, you can't have that sugary soda pop. You can't choose what you're going to put in your body. I know best. I know best how to tell you how to raise your children. That's not the job of government.
We have more coming up with Christy Zito, State Representative Christy Zito, in just a few minutes. It's 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. It's 15. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our studio guest, Christy Zito, she is the state representative this morning, joining us in studio. Again, session starts in 6 days in Boise. We're at 9:22. It's 17. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310. And also our website, newsradio1310.com, where you can listen live by clicking on the Listen Live icon. And I'm told that our new phone app is also available as well. So those folks who have a smartphone could download that as well and take us along anywhere you go. We do want to point out telephone number if you have a comment or question for the representative, 208-736-0300. We want to point out as well that her district is Elmore County, Owyhee County, and parts of Twin Falls County. It's not a secret. We were having a conversation off air before we got started today with Steve Millington about redistricting, and what they could end up doing is simply cleaving Owyhee County because it's not very populous, moving it up to Canyon County, moving Elmore County in with Ada County, and it's going to start giving the urban areas even more strength in the legislature, which people aren't aware of, but it's going to maybe take more and more of that legislative power away from the rural legislators.
Well, I agree if we're not careful, it will. And we have to remember that in a republic, the voice of the one is as important as the voice of the many. And that's what distinguishes us from a democracy. Now, there's been talk, and there's before this year even, that it would maybe be a good idea to have one senator from each county and one representative from each county. And then I believe that would leave 44 remaining. I'm not sure about the numbers on that exactly, and then those could be redistributed according to population, which would give you a better balance so that your rural areas don't lose their voice. And I really think that's really important, that we preserve that part of our republic, of the nature Republican, not Republican, but the nature of our government that is a republic.
We have a caller with us, and caller, you're up next. You're on KLIX.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the last caller. These two women are great. Too bad they can't replace Scott Becky. He's nothing but a damn rhino. He's just nothing more than a Mitt Rhino Romney. Thank you.
There are a lot of people with strong feelings about politics in Idaho, and Christy and I actually were just talking off air about the fact that in media it's often portrayed that there's two groups of Republicans and they're constantly at battle. But as it turns out, on 9 out of 10 things, you're mostly in agreement with your fellow Republicans, even Speaker Bedke and some of the other leaders.
Well, I have. I mean, there have been a lot of times I've supported the speaker and what he's done. Um, Chairman Lurcher, who gave me grief over the Castle Doctrine last year, I supported him several times on the floor about different legislation, and I like him. As we spoke before, oh, and by the way, I love your purple attire today.
Yes.
That's a really nice. That as we were speaking during the break, last year I had 20 co-sponsors on the Castle Doctrine bill that I tried to carry through. That's almost a third of the House. It would be hard pressed for me to see how a person who could work with that many legislators and get that many co-sponsors, how someone could say that I'm not willing to work with and that I don't get along with or agree with a lot of the people there.
A comment, somebody asked me earlier why I was wearing the purple and the Vikings hat, and because the Minnesota Vikings were one of a handful of teams that all of the players throughout the entire season stood for the national anthem. And I feel you have to give a tip of the hat
Absolutely.
to people who do that.
Absolutely.
When we talk about some of the differences that do exist, though, and I think a criticism I hear from callers on a radio show like this, and granted, not everybody calls a radio show, but there's a belief that, and it really is in both Democrats and in Republican parties, that there are some people there who, while they have the public in mind, may have more in mind some of the big players, and sometimes at the expense of the little guy in their district. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know that I would go so far as to say that, but what I do know is I can only speak for myself. And what I do know is I think it's very, very important, as we spoke before, that the decisions that are made there are pursuant to the Constitution, that we don't do anything that a neighbor couldn't do to another neighbor and have it be lawful and moral and right. Um, I know that there are a lot of powerful lobbyist groups in the state of Idaho, and I get that the citizen in the state of Idaho, the common, everyday, ordinary citizen, has their representative there. That is their lobbyist. You are your advocate for the people in your district. And it's important to keep that in mind. And it's important to make decisions that will impact lives in a positive way, not put additional burden. For instance, last year I voted against it, but to license sign language interpreters. My daughter in Colorado has a son who for a long time didn't speak, and he signed, and he was in and out of the hospital quite often, and they had taught him to sign. And there were times when, had there not been someone there or she hadn't been there to be able to interpret, because the time it could take, unless a hospital will now be forced to pay for an on-staff sign language interpreter all the time, which again is taking someone's liberty away to make that choice and decision, because you're forcing them to have to do something. Those few minutes while you're waiting for that person to show up could maybe make a huge difference.
You talk about regulation. I'm subject to a non-compete agreement, and when I took this job, I have that. So if tomorrow I'm not in this job, I cannot take a job for 12 months within 150 miles of here in radio. There's a big push among some business leaders, because we had a law that was shored up a few years ago to try and protect certain intellectual property in Idaho But now you've got some, I think it's hundreds of businesses that are saying this hurts us from attracting new talent. Will we see any action there this year in the legislature?
I read something about that here not too long ago. I'm not sure if there will be action on that in the legislature or not. I haven't heard that for sure. I haven't had anyone approach me about that or not. But again, there are certain things, that can be patented and trademarked and whatever that should be protected. But at the same time, um, we should not limit the ability of businesses and stuff. That's not the role of government to step in and take that place.
And I see that we talk a lot about liberty in this state, but we're harming people's ability to make a living or to ply their trade by doing this. And I read about this. It made the Wall Street Journal and it made the Heritage Foundation. They were talking about this law, but it seems that you have one group lobbying for the law, and then you have another strong group of lobbyists lobbying against the law. And that's what I mean. It seems too often it's government by lobbyists and not by people.
Well, they have a strong voice, and the lobbyist corps, it's not a bad thing because you get a lot of good information as long as, there's not a dollar attached to it or something like that. You get their side of it. There was a couple of times legislation last year that was very strongly debated in a couple of my different committees. And I know that the information I got from both sides from the lobbyists was really good information. My concern with it is, that it stay at an information level.
We've got more coming up with State Representative Christy Zito. It's 9:30, 18 right now. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. She referenced the Castle Doctrine. Maybe we can talk about that a bit, too, in the next half hour.
Perfect.
Our studio guest, Christy Zito, is a state representative joining us this morning who covers parts of Twin Falls County, Owyhee County, and Elmore County. It's a massive district geographically. It's District 23, and then you've got A and B, right?
I'm Seed A.
You're Seed A.
Mm-hmm.
And we should point out for people, I don't usually use the numbers much on the radio. It's maybe easier in a newsprint to do that. But on the radio, I just tend to tell people the geographic area so they can get a better feel for that.
Exactly.
But
it can be a little confusing when you start talking Seed A and Seed B.
Right. But you represent like areas out in Buell and in that part
Castle Ford,
Twin Falls County, because we talk about being a candidate who's or a legislator who's of the people. During one of the 4th of July parades a couple of summers ago, you were walking alone in the parade along the route where a lot of other people were riding on floats and in cars. And I took note of that. I was standing outside the ice cream shop, go figure, when you were walking by, and I thought, well, okay, she's right down there mixing with the crowd. I tend to see those symbolic type of gestures and recognize them.
Well, and I think it's important, and I love people, and I love to be around them. You remember when we used to talk when you were on the East Coast, and my background. I've always loved people. When we had our little farm, I had, I don't even know how many sometimes kids would be at my table, and you'd have to peel 10 pounds of potatoes to feed everybody. But how else are you going to know what people want? How else are you going? And I just see myself as a normal, everyday citizen, which I am. I'm just a mom and a grandma, and I don't just look at a person's situation and what they're going through and say, oh, I can see that. I know what it is to struggle to be able to put groceries on the table. I know what it is to face these challenges. And so I want to be with those people.
And we wanted to point out last year, you got a lot of attention around the state because of the Castle Doctrine bill, which you had researched. It's been done in other states as well. But I still don't know what's right and what's wrong on this because it became such a hot potato, speaking of potatoes, during the session, with different sides saying it's going to allow people to shoot people for stealing property or chase them down 2 weeks later and shoot them. And
that's ridiculous. That is an absolutely ridiculous statement.
How do all these things get started?
I have no idea. The person who made that statement had not been feeling well, and maybe it was cough medicine. I don't know. But that's ridiculous. There's no place in the law that would, allow a citizen to hunt another citizen down and shoot them for taking their property. What this does is it says that, which is already somewhat part of statute, if you're in your home, your car, your place of business, a relative's home, some place where you have a natural right to be, you have a natural right to defend that. If someone breaks into your home, if someone breaks into your business, comes in threatening or whatever, you have a natural right to protect yourself. And because of that, um, in Idaho, there was some where you had to be able to prove that you did not have an opportunity to retreat. Well, in those few seconds while you're trying to decide if you have an opportunity to retreat, it could be gone. We think of time in our minds usually in segments of hours, but seconds are huge. And for example, when I was in high school 100 years ago, I could tie a goat in 6 seconds. That's a lot to get done in 6 seconds. Ride down the arena, get off the horse, throw the goat, tie the goat, and get off all in 6 seconds. So if you think of what can take place in a matter of that short a period of time, you don't have time to stand there and look around and say, well, where can I retreat? What can I do? Where can I go? Someone could be harmed. So this doctrine will make it so that you don't have to prove that you had opportunity to retreat, and then you won't automatically be arrested if you've had to use your firearm to defend yourself.
There was a story out of Nevada on the Associated Press wire this morning. A fellow in Nevada shot and killed another man as the man was breaking into his car. Of course, he was sitting in the car when this happened. So as the guy busted in the door, he shot him and killed him. He's not going to be prosecuted. He had no opportunity to really retreat unless he was supposed to get out and run away from his own car.
Right, exactly. And why should you have to? Because again, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which includes your possessions, your what you work for, you have a right to defend and protect that. Now, if someone's breaking into your car, are you going to roll down the window and say, "Hey, what do you want? What can I do for you? Would you like to go get a cup of coffee?" Or, what have you got in your mind? Obviously, it's an act of aggression.
We wanted to point out Christy Zito as our guest. We've got about a minute before the break. Comments or questions, feel free to give us a call on the other side of that break as we come up on 9:40 this morning. We're at 18. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Will the bill come back this year?
Absolutely. It's written, it's ready. One of the first stops I plan to make as soon as I can catch up with him is to talk to Chairman Lurcher about having a print hearing for the bill.
As I understand it, 700 to 800 bills can be proposed before any session. I mean, I've seen the list. Clark Kaufman gave me the list last year, and it was incredible. And only a handful of those ever actually make it even to floor debate.
Right. That's what I understand. And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother discussion on a different day. We could go on about that for a long time as well, because I don't feel that the decision on what bills should be heard and what bills should not be heard should be made solely by one person in the House of Representatives. That's why we have a representative form of government.
We have more coming up with State Representative Christy Zito. 20 minutes now away from 10 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story as well. I hope you can stick around. State Representative Christy Zito joining us in studio for another 15, 20 minutes or so. Then we wrap up the day. A quick note, tomorrow morning, we're going to be joined in studio between 9 and 10 o'clock by Pastor Paul Thompson from Eastside Baptist Church here in Twin Falls. He has a new series going on at his church where Sunday evenings they have pastors from different denominations who come in and talk about Christian faith. And obviously that's open to the public. He'll talk about that more at length tomorrow morning. We're at coming up on 9:42, and the telephone number, if you'd like to reach us this morning, 208-736-0300. That's 208-736-0300. We haven't brought this up yet, but obviously every legislator has a list of priorities when you go into a new session. We talked about the Castle Doctrine. We talked about the grocery tax. But there have got to be some other things, too, that are piquing your interest.
Well, I have another bill that will be some lobbyist reform. The way the lobbyist, I call it the lobbyist legislation reads now, it's awfully broad, and it allows for broad interpretation. And we've changed some language in that bill to narrow the interpretation. And then right now, as it stands, a legislator or whatever can only accept, I hate to call it a gift, but I don't know what other verbiage to use right now, of $50, but the lobbyist disclosure is $105. So we changed that so that would match up. And what we've done is we've made it so that right now as it stands, if I'm involved in a bill, I can't take something from a legislator who's involved in that. We're making it so that if at any time you can't accept a gift over that. I think it's important because as we kind of spoke, there are lobbyists for everything, and a lot of government agencies have lobbyists that citizens are paying for through their taxes. But the citizen themselves as they stand, only has one person there to lobby for them, and that's their legislator. And so I think we need to really watch the lobbyist thing. Again, good information from both sides, but it's important to make sure that we keep it at an information level only.
I wanted to point out for people who are tuning in today that uh, you are looking to run for reelection.
Yes.
Uh, people didn't think you were going to win the last time when you defeated Rich. The two of you went to church together, I should note. I mean, you both come from a small community. You do have a primary opponent possibly this year.
Yes.
And so there is an effort by some in the Republican Party to push a certain group of you out of the way. And I think that unless your numbers get stronger or larger fast, that's going to be a constant. I won't call it a threat because in politics you expect these things, but it's going to be a constant presence in your life every couple of years where your constituents may love you, but certain leaders in the party don't.
I agree. I agree. And that's exactly what my situation is. The person that is running against me actually served as an alternate for the other representative in our district. And so there will be that push. And but again, it's up to the citizens of your district. I will serve as long as the citizens of the District 23 want me to serve and represent them. There's life before and life after, and I'm not there for the power. I'm not there to say I'm a representative. I'm there to represent the people. I work for the people. I don't work for the state government or anything else.
It seems to me, though, that there is an ongoing effort among certain people within your own Republican side of the aisle to try and discredit all of you. Last year, when you were proposing the Castle Doctrine, you had shared the story on the radio, too, as well, about how you were with your daughter. Some people approached you, and you were able, because you were armed, to protect your family. And one of your colleagues tried to, he didn't come out and call you a liar, but he said, well, gee, where's the police record on this?
Right.
Look, I was coming out of a restaurant in Buffalo, New York, in the winter of 1986, and a fellow came up to me, and it made me a little nervous. And luckily, there was a police officer sitting nearby. They jumped out of the police car. They must have been looking for him already. They grabbed him, yelled out his name, grabbed him, and threw him in the back seat. They told me to just move along. There's no record of the fact that he may have been trying to rob me, but it happened. I was there, and I was grateful that they were there as well. But the fact of the matter is, uh, someone was trying to imply that you were making this all up.
Well, and that's true. And, that's fine, if they want to see it that way or if they want to say that, because you'll either believe me or you won't. But I think there are hundreds of things that happen every day that don't get reported to the police. I mean, who was I supposed to call, right? It ended well. My daughter was safe. I was safe. And in my mind at that time, that's all that mattered. And they were gone and out of the way. If you've not been in a situation like that, you probably don't understand, especially when you're a mom alone with your daughter. Someone asked me, they said, well, didn't you get the license plate number? Well, at that moment, when they got in their truck and drove away, the last thing on my mind was the license plate number. The most important thing in my mind at that moment was to make sure that my daughter was okay. Because even though we weren't physically harmed, my thoughts and my concerns were to her, and are you okay? And in your mind and mentally, are you good? It wasn't what was their license plate number or what would happen. And because there was not a crime committed, again, it would have just been my word against their word, and there wouldn't have been a whole lot to gain anyway.
See, the thing I think that for a lot of us, we sit back and we see this internal sort of strife going on amongst Republicans. And I'll try to make a good example of what I'm talking about by taking something from out of state. When I heard a lot of criticism of Cliven Bundy and his associates over the last couple of years from Republicans and so-called conservatives, then we learned last week the Oregonian had a story that the prosecution was generally rigging this case. And I stop and I draw back, and I'm going to tell you right now, I think a lot of folks, if there is such a thing as an establishment Republican, but those people we might perceive as establishment Republicans are still going to say, well, yes, but they should have done things differently. Even though the public, though, is now more aware that sometimes government isn't always your friend. And I think that the group that you work with within the legislature that you work with well recognizes that. And maybe that's the difference. a lot of Republicans can say government, should be out of our lives. But I don't think they realize just how difficult it is for a lot of people who actually live every day with government intrusion. Because let's face it, for a lot of people who are elected to the legislature, they come from a really nice house in a really nice part of town. Nobody bothers them. But somebody who's living out on a rural road or has a ranch out in the backwoods and maybe isn't politically connected, it's not so easy for all of you.
No, it's not. And the ranch thing is a really, really good example. We have the Lowrys and the Joyce Ranch, Tim Nettleton. They actually mounted a lawsuit to defend their stockwater rights against the BLM, which should have been a state fight. They won their lawsuit, but now they owe close to $1 million in attorney fees, which will probably, in the end, if something isn't done, will cost them that anyway. If you live in a house in town, you're not going to be affected by that. But the thing to remember is those water rights are older than the BLM. A lot of those water rights are older than the states in which these people live. That's how they make their living. Those water rights have value. You can take them to the bank and use them as collateral. I used to use the example on our little farm. We had road on 3 sides of our farm, and people would stop and pick stuff all the time. And this one morning, we'd had a light frost, and there's a guy driving down the tomato rows in my field. And so I went out there and I asked him, I said, "What are you doing? Why are you driving in the field?" He said, "Well, they're frozen." I said, "You don't know that. You don't know what's under the vines. Besides that, you have no right to drive in my field without my permission." And I asked him what his address was. And he said, "Why do you want to know my address?" And I said, "Because I'm going to come and drive on your lawn. Or if you have a garden, I'm going to drive across your lawn and get to your garden." Well, he didn't think that was so funny anymore. And until it does touch us, until it does have an impact on our lives, sometimes we just go along thinking everything's okay. But the licensure thing is huge as well. Just like the cosmetology thing last year. For that to be vetoed, we are stopping good people from making a living, and all it does is it's a protectionist mentality for those who are already in the business. Now, as it stands right now today in the state of Idaho, you don't have to be licensed to do eyelash extensions. I spoke with someone at the Board of Licensing this summer to clarify whether that was indeed fact or not, and they said, yes, indeed it was, but they're going to fix that. So what's the point? So now some gal who has a lot of talent but maybe can't afford to spend all the money on cosmetology school will not get to feed her family or help her family because now she has to be licensed and she has to go through school and jump through all of the hoops when she could be out adding to society, maybe taking fully care of her family because of something she could do like that.
We have a caller with us, and it's about 10 minutes from 10 o'clock. Caller, you're up next. You're on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Yeah, Bill, I'm a big fan of yours, but you're dead wrong on the Bundy issue. Bloke hadn't paid his grazing fees for 20 years. I understand. Yeah, the grazing fees in arrears were a little over $8,000. It's just like your IRS. You don't pay your tax. The penalties and the interest end up being more than the tax. I think one of the reasons I'm here is Yanks do the grazing in the commons. That's what this problem is. Right. You're casting BLM in negative light. Most of the blokes, most of the lasses I've been around, interviewed, talked to, don't want to see any rancher out of business. The whole problem comes down to that there is such a thing as overgrazing. Grazing doesn't mean I get to pound the land to dust. I've had ranchers try and remove me from public land, say, well, it's my allotment. Well, that's very nice, mate. I'm not trying to graze cows or sheep here. Well, you've got to get off of it. No, I don't. The only thing I can't do is graze it. So that's just an alternative thought. Don't blame the BLM. There's such a thing as overgrazing. Public lands are indeed public.
Well, I want to thank you for the call. Interesting. I had a conversation with Dorothy Mood about the Bundy situation, seeing that Ammon is one of her constituents. And she said that Cliven was actually paying his fees, but he was sending them off to Carson City versus Washington. And so the notion that he was, hugely in debt to the federal government may have been a bit of somebody within the bureaucracy didn't get everything put together as they should have.
Well, and that's what I understand as well. And, a wise man told me years and years ago, if you want to know what's really going on, follow the money. And as we're starting to see now on a national level, there's a lot of uranium out there and then their hills. And we're finding out that there were some, behind the doors, billion-dollar uranium deals that went on. And a lot of those minerals lie under that dirt where these ranchers actually ranch. And, I find it interesting. There are people who will um, abuse the land or abuse whatever. There are people who will get a brand new car and beat it up. But the thing that I think is important to remember, having grown up in the ranching environment, my grandpa had a ranch. He was on the Snowville, Stone, Idaho border, and my great grandmother actually owned a ranch in Stone. It would make absolutely no sense to me, and it still doesn't, for a rancher or a farmer or anyone to abuse the very soil that supports their family and their way of life. I mean, we're not just talking about people who are throwing 100 cows out here on this range to graze the hell out of it because they don't have anything better to do. This is their livelihood.
He brought up a good point, though. If he's walking across public lands, he's not interfering with anybody's cattle who are out there grazing. And I would agree with that. I used to drive the back country when I first got here before I sold my Jeep considerably. And we've got another situation that's brewing. We have a wealthy family of Texans who are buying tens of thousands of acres of land in Montana and Idaho. And there's concern by sportsmen. They don't have a problem with the land being purchased. They're worried they're going to lose access. And if there's a road that goes back into public land, there's concern that that road could be shut down. That's going to be an issue that's going to make its way to the legislature.
I think it will. I think there's probably already legislation in place. There are already law and statute in place that will probably cover that. I haven't really looked into that a lot, so I don't really feel like I'm in a good position to discuss it in depth. I've read some about it. There are prescriptive right-of-ways. There are different kinds of easements and different right-of-ways and stuff like that for passage. I think it will be important to balance between private ownership of land and access to the public lands. If the roads are there and they've been used and they've always been used, that's one thing, the way I understand it. I don't think you can just go in and arbitrarily shut down a roadway. We had an access road right behind our house. It probably wasn't 20 feet behind our back door in our home in Tremont. And because the people had used that road for so many years, they had a right to use it, a prescriptive right-of-way to use that. And I think we'll find, as this goes on, more and more of that kind of situation.
Got about 2 minutes to go. We'll take another caller. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on Top Story.
Yeah, I'm responding to the call just before me. You know something? If you do a little research about these farmers, these ranchers who have grazing rights, and it's not just the BLM, it's the Forest Service, and some of the things that have been done to them by both the BLM and the Forest Service, and it's, whether or not most of the guys are good guys or not, or want to run them off or not, it doesn't matter, because ultimately what happens to these ranchers, they have a livelihood established, and then it's taken away, and there's uncertainty in their futures. And some of these men have lost, whether or not it's in Washington or Idaho or elsewhere in the West, where they've lost grazing rights, or their grazing ground has been burnt to the ground because of mismanagement by the Forest Service, and these men are out of business. They're broke. Some of these guys have been ranching since the 1800s in their families, and they're out of business. It would help that gentleman to do a little research instead of just talk about a bloke. I'll hang up.
Well, okay. Christy, you've got about 40 seconds.
Well, I agree. And the proof is out there, that the government agencies see that. Just like we talked about the Joyce deal, in the 1990s, there were 40 ranches that were saved through the process of coordination because their AUMs were going to be cut arbitrarily. I was out on the Owyhees the summer before. I saw where there were cattle in an allotment that were hungry, and they were riding the fence because they were hungry, and on the other side of the fence there was grass that could be grazed. But because the BLM or the Forest Service or whomever at that moment didn't think those cattle should be moved through that gate onto that pasture, they stood there hungry. The ranchers know the land. The ranchers know their cattle. They're husbands of the land. They're not there to destroy it. They're not there to make it so that it's not productive or functional or beautiful. It's their livelihood. That's how they make their livings. It's to their benefit to take care of it.
I should have said Representative Zito. I called her Christy.
That's okay.
I've known her since about a decade before I moved to Idaho. So I want to point out she's probably the person I've known longest in Idaho government. There you go. We've got a short break. I want to thank you for coming by.
My pleasure, Bill. Anytime. Thank you so very much for having me.
Rush Limbaugh is coming up next. He should be back from his long vacation on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. First, Fox News. And God willing, at the Creektown Rise, I'll be back in studio tomorrow between 8 and 10 o'clock.